the work she's been doing over the past several months for her thesis project. Take it away, Ashleigh.
So hi, I'm Ashleigh Woolf, and I'm going to be talking about my research that I did over the summer for my senior thesis, which is on confirming parasite resistance to Ivermectin and testing the efficacy of alternative antiparasite drugs as a treatment for Haemonchus contortus in herd-oriented ruminants. And this research was done at the Sunny Rock 4-H facility in Sharon, Massachusetts. So the goal of my research was basically to investigate drug resistance of the parasite Haemonchus contortus. And Haemonchus contortus is commonly known as the barber pole worm. And the barber pole worm is a hemophilic parasite that affects the gastrointestinal tract of a ruminant, which is a four-stomach animal, such as a sheep or a goat. And the barber pole worm has always been present in the environment of livestock animals. However, over the past 20 years, there has been a significant increase in reported deaths of animals from a barber pole worm infestation. And the barber pole worm has the harshest effect on herd-oriented ruminants because of the close quarters that the animals live in. So the parasite is very easily passed from one animal to another. But the most problematic thing about the barber pole worm is that it can remain in the feces of the animal for 90 days. So as you can guess, this longevity proves to be quite problematic for farmers who have difficulty getting rid of the parasite and making sure that animals don't get reinfected when they graze on the pasture. So here you can see a nice diagram of the digestive system of a ruminant. And as I said before, a ruminant has 4 stomachs. And the most important part about this figure is to note the location of the abomasum. And that is because the abomasum is where the barber pole worm resides, and that is where it latches onto the gastrointestinal tissue and drains the energy and the blood of the animal. So, as I said before, the barber pole worm is a blood-leaching parasite, so it causes general symptoms of weakness such as anemia, weight loss, diarrhea, and rapid dehydration. And the barber pole worm also causes an edema, which is when the small blood vessels leak fluid into the tissue between the 2 lower jaw bones of the animal. And that causes the telltale bottle jaw, as you can see in the image. However, the bottle jaw is not always present in a barber pole worm infestation. But the most problematic thing about the barber pole worm is that it can cause sudden death, often in 24 hours. And this is unusual for parasites. And this occurs when the animal system suddenly becomes overloaded with parasites and can no longer deal with the number of parasites in the system, and they rapidly deteriorate. So you can see why it's so important to study the barber pole worm, because you can have one animal healthy at 1 minute and dead at another minute. So here is a brief diagram of the life cycle of the barber pole worm. And you can see that the eggs start out in the abomasum of the ruminant, and they hatch, and the larvae are deposited onto the ground through the feces of the animal. And the larvae are then picked up by another animal and make their way to the abomasum, where they mature and the cycle begins once again. So the most common test used to look for a presence of barber pole worm in ruminants is the FAMACHA test. And this is basically looking at the packed blood cell value of the animal's eyelid. So you're basically looking for anemia, because that is the #1 symptom that the barber pole worm causes. And so here you can see the different coloration of the eyelid that you're looking for. However, this method is not reliable in early stages of parasite infestation, because it is assumed that all livestock animals will have a basic level of parasites in their system, just like you and I have a basic level of bad bacteria in our system. And so you can't tell exactly when an animal's system will no longer be able to deal with the parasite load that they have in their body. So the global impact on health is that these humans are very easily susceptible to parasites, and parasites can cause many symptoms in humans, ranging from blindness to neurological problems to liver cancer, and can even cause fetal death. And I feel like this quote from the CDC really highlights why it's so important to study parasites and parasite drug resistance, because 300,000 people are hospitalized in the United States every year from parasite-related illness. And these parasites also have a global economic impact, and that is because they have a large effect on the meat and dairy industry. So as you can imagine, the parasites reside in the tissue of the animal. So when the animal is taken to slaughter and becomes part of our food supply, it can make people very sick, as you saw before. And these parasites also have a large impact on the global food supply, especially in areas where farmers rely very heavily on their animals, and that is because I calculated that a small farmer could lose $700,000 over the course of his or her herd's lifetime, which is 10 to 12 years. And you can imagine that this cost and this loss due to parasite and parasite resistance makes it very difficult for these small farmers to compete with the industrial-sized farms. So what do we currently use to treat the barb worm? So the industry standard drug used to treat the barb worm is Ivomec. And Ivomec has been used for the past 40 years since its initial introduction in 1978. And it very quickly, when first introduced, became the industry standard because of how effective it was at reducing the number of parasites in the sheep system and virtually saving a sheep from a life-threatening emergency parasite infestation. However, it doesn't work. And the reason I chose to do my research is because last year we lost 25% of our lambs born due to barb worm infestations after they had been treated with Ivomec. So I really wanted to investigate this parasite resistance to Ivomec. So as I was saying, resistance began to develop in 1983 due to overuse and improper use. And basically what was happening was that farmers were not properly instructed on how to utilize the drug. So they were giving the drug treatment too often and with not enough dosage. And therefore the parasites that were surviving the treatment very quickly became resistant to Ivomec. And an additional effect caused by this resistance to Ivomec is that the antibiotic streptomycin was being used to treat a barb worm infestation for two reasons. One, because farmers would often equate symptoms of an E. coli infection and a barb worm infestation, and also because they would mistake the barb worm infestation for an E. coli infection after the Ivomec had no effect on the health of the animal. So, as you can see, there is a problem with the drug resistance to Ivomec. So what else actually is there? So the goal of my research was to investigate drugs that would not have as much resistance as Ivomec does. And the criteria for the different drugs that I was going to select were that, one, they had to be available without a prescription. And this is because a large animal vet is not nearly as available as a small animal vet is in the large animal industry. You can imagine trying to take a 200-pound sheep to a vet clinic. So we had to be able to get the drug online easily without needing permission from a vet. And it also had to be available in oral form because it would be inefficient for us to inject all of the sheep in the herd with the drug. So I followed the advice of Dr. Ulf Kinzel, who's a veterinarian at Cornell, and he recommended using Cydectin and Prohibit against the barb worms instead of Ivomec. And so those are the two drugs I use. And you can see in this quick cost analysis that Cydectin and Prohibit are in the range of cost comparably to Ivomec. And actually, even though Cydectin is the most expensive per gallon, because of its low dosage requirement, it has the lowest relative cost as compared to Ivomec. So the purpose of this research was to, one, determine if there was parasite resistance to Ivomec, because up until this point it had just been a rumor around farmers in New England, and then to also determine which of the two other drugs used in the trial, Cydectin and Prohibit, would be more effective both in the short term for an emergency treatment of an animal who's very sick, or in the long term for more procedural deworming. So I hypothesized that Cydectin and Prohibit would have a higher efficacy than Ivermectin due to the long-term development of parasite resistance to Ivermectin. So methods and materials. And before I go into methods and materials, these are two quick facts that we made sure of before we started the experiment. And one is that all the sheep in the experiment were determined to be healthy by a large animal veterinarian before the experiment was started. So a previous health condition of one sheep or any sheep cannot be considered as a factor in the experiment. And another is that all the sheep in the herd are very closely related, so any genetic differences and natural genetic resistance to the parasites cannot be considered as a factor either. So the setup was we first took 8 sheep and we put them on fresh pasture, and we left them there for 24 hours and then collected 10 fecal samples from the sheep. And this was in order to create a baseline control for the entire experiment of how many parasites were in the system of the sheep. Because as I said before, it is assumed that all livestock animals will have parasites in their system, but we wanted to know how many. We then separated the 8 sheep into 2 separate groups, yearling ewes and aged ewes. And the yearling ewes are defined as female sheep born in the last year, and the aged ewes are female sheep 3 to 4 years old. And we did this in order to rule out the factor of weight and age, because as you can imagine, the larger an animal is, the more parasites they will have in their system, but also the older an animal is, the stronger their immune system can be. And we then, of course, treated each ewe with her own respective drug. So here you can see the aged ewes set up in their individual pens. And here are the yearlings. And you can see that each pen was individualized, so we knew exactly which fecal sample we were getting from which sheep. And they were also lined with rubber mats for easy cleaning with a disinfectant solution. We also performed the Famacha test, which I talked about earlier, on both the aged ewes and the yearlings. And this was, again, in order to determine that the sheep had a basic parasite level in their system, because there's no point doing a drug-resistant study on sheep that don't have any parasites. So, as you can see from the coloring of their eyes, some are light pink, some are even lighter pink, near white, so they definitely had a parasite level in their system that we were looking to treat. So here is our procedure, and the most important thing about this is that we made sure to get a certain amount of solution diluted from the fecal sample in order to put it under the microscope and see exactly how many barleyworm were in each sample. And so we took 10 samples at 24, 48, and 72 hours, and then we repeated the trial without the initial drug treatment at 35 days later. And this was because that was the recommended time that the drug companies stated that the drug should stay in the sheep system and be effective. So we wanted to see the longevity of the drugs as well as the initial effectiveness. So here are some pictures of the barleyworm under the microscope. And results. So here is the first figure for the results, and it's important to note that the first column is the control, and then the Ivermectin, Cydectin, and Prohibit. And the different bar colors are the different days. So the blue is the 24, the orange is the 48, and the gray is the 72 hours, and then the yellow is the 35 days later. And the vertical axis is the number of parasites that we saw in the sample. And as you can see from these results, the control and the Ivermectin have very similar results, very similar numbers, and so they had very similar number of parasites in each of the samples. And even though ivermectin does dip slightly at the 48 and 72 hour mark, it is not significantly different from the Cydectin results. And if you compare that to the Cydectin and the Prohibit, you can see that the Cydectin and Prohibit have a much greater decrease in the number of parasites in the sample. And here is the comparison of the aged ewes as compared to the yearlings, and this was to determine if weight and age are a factor, and as you can see, they are not, because the results are very similar. So the aged ewes is the orange on top, and the yearlings is the yellow, and you can see that the results even cross for some points of the data. So this graph is showing the percentage reduction in parasites versus the control. And so in this case, the vertical axis is the percent that the parasites were reduced as compared to the control samples. And so you can see that ivermectin has a very low percentage of reduction as compared to the control, whereas Cydectin and Prohibit have much higher percentage reduction. But what's important to note in this figure is that Cydectin has a much more immediate reduction. However, at the 35-day mark, the percentage reduction is quite low, whereas Prohibit has a much more gradual percentage reduction. However, at the 35-day mark, the percentage reduction is still very similar to what it was in the first 72 hours. So what does those results actually mean? It means that we found that the percentage reduction of ivermectin in the parasite sample is 9% and Prohibit 54%, and Cydectin has the greatest percentage reduction of parasites for the whole trial with 64% reduction. And so what does that actually mean for us? So that means that Cydectin, as I said, has a stronger immediate effect, whereas Prohibit is much more effective in the long run. And that means that we would use Cydectin in emergency cases where an animal is visibly sick and visibly has symptoms of a barber bollworm infestation, whereas we would use Prohibit for more routine deworming. And so I calculated by dividing the Cydectin efficacy by the ivermectin efficacy, and then once again dividing that by the relative cost of Cydectin to ivermectin, that Cydectin is 12 times more effective at reducing the number of parasites in the sheep than ivermectin is. And I actually found this to be anecdotally true because, as I said before, last year we lost 25% of our lambs to barber bollworm after treating them with ivermectin, and this year we treated with Cydectin and have lost none.
Yeah.
So for further research, I would like to look at a number of things. The most important thing is I would like to look at different drugs, because I like to look at drugs that have the same active ingredients as Cydectin and Prohibit, which are the two that were effective in the trial. So the active ingredient of Cydectin is moxidectin. And the reason moxidectin is so effective is because it has a greater affinity for fat. So it lasts much longer in the system of the ruminant. And it also has a different method of paralyzing and ultimately killing the parasites, in that it binds to the parasites' glutamate-gated chloride ion channels, and those basically override the muscle movement of the parasite and cause paralysis, which ultimately leads to death. And the active ingredient for Prohibit is levomycin, and it has also a different method of paralyzing the parasite, in that it works as an agonist on the nicotine acetylcholine receptors. So it basically causes constant stimulus of the muscles, which causes them to basically freeze up and cause paralysis in the parasites. And also studies found that it works well when coupled with moxidectin, which is the active ingredient from Cydectin. And so here is a chart of the different drugs available on the market. And I bolded the ones that were relevant to this study. And so, as I was saying, I would like to look at, for example, Quest, which has the same active ingredient as Cydectin, which is moxidectin, or Levosol, which is the same active ingredient as prohibit, which is levomycel. And the reason for this is I'd like to see if it is truly this active ingredient that is causing cydectin and prohibit to be much more effective than Ivomec, or if it is something else that I have not explored yet in the drugs. So I'd like to acknowledge my amazing advisor, Dr. Terry Taylor. Without her help and support, this would never have been as great as it is. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Rosemary White, who is my BUA advisor, for all her help and support. And also Joe Major, who's the director of the 4-H facility. And without him, this research would never have been possible. So thank you. And exciting.
Very nicely done.
So given the effectiveness of cydectin and prohibit and its comparable cost to the existing drugs, what are some barriers that are preventing full switch to these more effective?
Right, so I think one of the problems is knowledge. I think a lot, because farms are often so spread out, there's not a lot of communication about this resistance, and because it's just kind of been an assumption that Ivomec has been a problem, there hasn't actually been, I guess, a report going out to say that these drugs are better. But as you saw from Dr. Ulf Kinzel, there are people who are starting to turn to other drugs. But also there's so many different drugs available that a lot of people don't have time to test out all of them. So my goal would be to really test out most of the drugs and then tell all the farmers in New England which one is the most effective.
So is there a reason why you only used female sheep, and is there also a reason to why you only chose the aged ewes and the yearling ewes instead of maybe working also with lambs to have a wider age range?
That is a good question. So the second question I can answer first, and that is because we didn't have any lambs available at that time. The yearlings actually were the lambs, but we did this in July, and so they were 5 months old. So I guess they could be considered lambs, yearlings. And the first question, because our rams are not genetically related to our herd, and so we wanted the genetic differences, because some sheep may have a natural immunity to parasites. We didn't want that to be a factor. So we wanted just the mothers and their babies. We didn't want rams who are completely differently genetic from our ewes.
So what is your current deworming protocol now at Sunnybrook? What are you doing?
I think we're using cydectin. I'd like to look into prohibit, but we haven't started deworming them just yet. But I think we're going to use cydectin because the lower dosage benefits us, because it's easier to give such a low dosage to them rather than a large dosage, which is what prohibit is. So I think that's what we're gonna do.
So you said that cydectin is like very effective immediately at emergency cases. So is there a point where it wouldn't work? Is there a point where the parasite is so developed that it would not help at all?
I'd like to explore that. I only did the first 72 hours and then 35-day mark, so I would like to see where the tipping point is of when it doesn't work. I haven't gone into that yet, but yeah, I'm guessing that there is a point where one becomes more effective than the other.
You mentioned that Ivomec lost its potency because of misuse. So what are some tactics that can be to ensure that cydectin doesn't also become misused and ineffective?
I think it's once again proper knowledge and proper education, but I think I also have to do more research into, as Vika was saying, how long the drug lasts, because you want to give people very explicit instructions of how much to dose the sheep with and also how often to do it. So I would have to look into how long it actually lasts in their system before sending out word of how long they should not deworm for before doing it once again. And I think another way that that could be prevented is to switch from Cydectin to prohibit, or to switch from one drug to another drug. Because if you're using one drug for 6 months and you're using another drug for another 6 months, it causes less resistance than if you're just using one drug.
I have one, maybe final one. You had said, someone had said something at the very end about, I think it was a doctor or researcher that said that this drug works particularly well with this one. Is that something you want to do though, is have two at the same time? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you were saying by.
So that is what they did, so it's not, sorry, that wasn't very clear. It's not exactly at the same time, it's more what I was saying before, like if you use one for a few weeks and then you switch and use another one, they found that moxidectin and levomyosol just happen to work very well together. So I would be interested in doing that, but you can also just use one drug continuously. It just might cause more resistance.
Any final questions? All right, very nice.